Okay, so first thing I want to do is go back into my raw file and do some initial balancing and turn on lens corrections. Let's check that out. So you'll see now why having this raw file load into Photoshop as a smart object gives me a ton of flexibility, because I can always go back into that and make changes to my raw file. First steps, the way that I like to work with my raw files, are to really peel off any sort of major processing that the photographer may have done. Now, it's really important for you to get that initial processing that shows the photographer's vision. But when it comes down to preparing your file to work in Photoshop and to retouch on top of, you don't want to retouch on top of some dramatic lighting or intense contrast or crazy color shifts or things like that. What you want to do to start with your file is to really balance things out so you have the highest quality, highest level of detail in all the dark and light areas, and correct anything that looks like a big mistake that might have been introduced from the initial grading from the photographer. What I'm going to do first is, because I know I need to turn this shirt to black, I really want to make sure that there isn't any blown out information in the lighter parts, so I just start cranking the highlights and whites down. And you can see how this really starts to flatten the image out, but that's okay, because in the dark areas too, what I'm doing is I'm bringing back detail that might have been either blown out in the whites or plugged up or filled in the dark areas. So that's a pretty simple change. I don't mess with the exposure, especially in an image like this. I don't want to bring that up or down. I just want to mess with these sliders that bring back information in the more extreme areas of contrast. I want to, at this stage, keep clarity at 0. That can get some really good effects in adding contrast, but it's going to fight against what I did with balancing and flattening out the image in these areas here. So next I'm going to go and enable profile corrections in this image, and you can see how it fixes some of that lens distortion that's happening. At this stage, this is pretty much all that I want to do with this image and bring it back into Photoshop, because I know that this is balanced in a way that I can safely start working on top of all this information. All right, so it's worth mentioning now, what you saw me just do to this image may seem really counterintuitive to you. Normally, the way that a photographer is going to approach an image in RAW is to do a bunch of processing in there. What I do is the exact opposite. I balance it out, like I said, to retain as much information through every tonal area of the image as possible. All right, I'm going to turn my markup off just because I don't need it right now. And the last little tweak I'm going to make before getting into the shoes is I'm going to rotate the image just a little bit, because I noticed that the horizon is a little bit tweaked, and I'd like to get that to be more of a perfect horizontal. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's just nice to get that more horizontal. It's really important to do a global rotation move at this stage, because if you wait to do it later, all the stuff you've stacked on top of your base image, it's going to screw you over. So do that right at the beginning. All right, so now it's time to move on to our shoes and integrating them and seeing if they actually work in this image. I've already got some selects made that I think are going to work. I'm going to show you how to open those up and prep those into the image so that we can make sure that they're good and they're going to comp in right. So I'm going to open up my 2 raw files for these shoes that we shot. And first thing I'm going to do is crop down to just about what I need, leaving a little bit of space around them. Using the crop tool, just draw a loose square pretty close to the edges of the shape that you want to comp in. Now, I'm going to select both and open these as smart objects into Photoshop before I do any processing of these shoes, because I don't want to waste any time. At this stage, I just want to make sure that these shoes are going to work for the composite. And I'm just going to rough comp them in to make sure the position and scale, stuff like that all fits, because I don't want to do any work that I have to redo. Open these smart objects in Photoshop. Okay, what I'm going to do is take each shoe, and what's fantastic, remember, we've set all raw files to open into Photoshop as smart objects, so I can always go back in and modify these to bring back any blown out detail or any filled in detail. First thing I'm going to do, because I want to move fast, I want to be able to see if these actually work. I'm not going to do any saving out of these files. I'm just going to drag in the smart object right into my composition to see if I can get them to sit into place. First shoe, just going to drag that right in. Place that roughly over the back shoe. Turn off my guides and my rulers with Command semicolon, Command R. I'm going to reduce the opacity on this shoe down to something like, let's say 60. Now, what I want to do is position this roughly over his back shoe and just start by transforming that in. Looks like it fits pretty good. What we're going to try to do is align that as closely as possible with the back shoe, because that's a really good point of reference. And I know that if I get that shoe to match up with the existing back one, that's going to look pretty realistic, because the architecture of shoes, especially these sports shoes, is going to be pretty consistent between one and the other. So you can always look to the shoe that's in the existing composite to match up elements, because that's going to be a great roadmap. It's already there and we know it's real. The next step after transform is to right click and go into warp. Transform is going to transform or change the size and scale of the entire shoe pretty uniformly. At that stage, we just want to match the size and position and rotation generally. Now we drill down to more specific adjustments of the image, and warp allows us to do that next step. So notice now that I'm in warp, I can adjust more specific parts of the shape. And you'll see this as a theme consistently in all aspects of retouching. I generally go from macro to micro. The bigger picture stuff, drilling down into more specifics. Just keep that in mind. I'm only really making minor tweaks at this stage because this shoe is matching up pretty well. So I've got this roughly in place, and I'm just going to hit enter and bring the opacity back up and just real quickly go back and forth. And I can see some differences here in the shape of the shoe. But I know generally this shoe is going to work in this space. I might go back in to my transform, Command T. This is what's nice about transforming on a smart object. Go back into my warp and you'll see the changes I made are kept in here in a dynamic way that's totally non-destructive, and I can continue to edit that. I'm just going to bring up the bridge of the shoe a bit to a little bit better mimic the shoe behind it. But at this stage, I'm not going to do super careful tweaking. We're going to do a little bit more of that as we move forward into the retouching. Now, I'm going to turn that off. What shoe was that I just did? Now let's work with the other shoe. I'm going to drag the front shoe in. And do the same thing I did with that back shoe, just to make sure it works. Reduce the opacity. I usually choose 60 for some reason. It's one of those habits that you find yourself getting into. Choose whatever works for you that allows you to see it the best. I'm going to go into warp. And try to get the shape to match up a little bit better. Now you can see I'm using a lot of artistic license here on how I'm warping this shoe around. Now, as long as you preserve the basic structure of the shoe, you can actually get away with quite a lot at this stage. I'm changing some of the overall structure of the shoe in a way that might look drastic, but in this case, as long as you're just preserving the overall shape, nobody's going to really know. So use your best judgment, but the main goal is to get it to match up with the existing shoe if they're a similar build, while still preserving the shape but making it look realistic. I'm going to enter out of that, and it looks like a pretty good one-to-one match. So I'm pretty confident that these shoes are going to work now. I'm ready to move on to the next step and actually commit to using these shoes in a linked workflow. All right, first step, I'm going to pull the opacity all the way back up on these shoes. And if you didn't know this, as long as you have the Move tool active, you can hit any key on the number pad to change the opacity in a snap. First, what I'm going to do, since these are embedded smart objects, I need to save out the shoes somewhere on my hard drive so I can replace those with linked smart objects. All right, so let's save this shoe to the hard drive in my working folder. I'm going to create a new folder called linked. In this case, I'm going to put an underscore at the beginning. And what that does will always float that folder to the top. I'm just going to save that as large document format. Do the same with the other shoe. Now I'm ready to incorporate these two shoes into my working file, which I also need to save, but not in my linked folder, in my working folder. I'm going to incorporate those shoes in now as linked smart objects. I'm not going to give a full demo on smart objects or linked smart objects here, but just know that linking to a smart object or creating a linked smart object is referencing a file that's on your hard drive someplace. So what that means is in that file, you're going to do all your work, and in this big working file, it's basically just going to reference that file and show you a preview of what you've done, and that updates dynamically as you save your linked object. Okay, So these are embedded smart objects right now, and in order to change them to a linked smart object where it's referencing a file on my hard drive, all I have to do is right-click on the layer name and say relink to file, and choose that file on my hard drive and select place. Do the same thing for this other one. Make sure you've got the right file. And notice how the icons changed to this chain or linked icon. These are now linked smart objects. And since these shoe files that I've got open in Photoshop are the same ones that I saved to the hard drive and referenced in this linking process, I can now start work on these files and they'll update in my working file whenever I save them. Now, think about the power of this. When I'm working in one of my linked files, every time I hit save, it's going to update my working file with the changes I've made. Now, when you're working in your own studio by yourself, that's pretty cool. But think about if you have a more distributed work system, say you've got a lot of compositing to do with a lot of different elements. And if you're working with another artist, another retoucher, or maybe you work in a studio where you have assistants, what you can do with this workflow is distribute that work across multiple people. And if you have linked smart objects active in your working file, you can be working on that. Somebody else can be working on one of the components. And as they finish that work, it's going to magically update in your working file. So just keep that in mind as a bigger workflow solution as you get bigger scale projects.